Hello, everyone. Yeah, so I'm Demkowicz. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology of education in the Manchester Institute of Education. And I think relevant to the discussions we're having today, I am a multi-method and mixed methods researcher. So I have my head in both quantitative and qualitative contexts pretty much all the time. Jo?
And I'm Jo. I'm a research fellow at the Manchester Institute of Education, and I work on a project that looks at adolescent social media use and mental health. I'm not a mixed methods researcher. I'm very much in the qualitative domain. So sorry, Murillo, I'm just all of what you said. And I'm hoping for other people in the room, it also went straight over your head and you're like, qualitative is my bag. And if not, then just hang on. We're just going to peek a little bit into the box of this idea of more holistic forms of assessment that sort of Stephen spoke about this morning. So I promised earlier I would do most of the legwork for this because she does lots of legwork for everything else. So I'm going to do a lot of talking and Ola's going to chip in if I miss anything out.
You said I could ramble when I want
and you
to.
can ramble,
Great,
yeah.
thank you.
So a couple of points today, people have touched on registered reports. I'm sort of going to make an assumption that generally people know what they are, but I think it's helpful just to recap. So we will do that. And then this presentation is really born out of a commentary that Ola and I wrote, co-authored on qualitative registered reports in mental health research, which was a response to an editorial from Jessie Baldwin at UCL, who wrote a really nice piece on the value of registered reports for mental health research. Generally, Ola and I, at the time, were working on registered reports and qualitative registered reports, and we read Baldwin's piece and went, what? She doesn't talk about qualitative research at all. So we thought we better correct that. And so Baldwin's piece was great. And what you get is a 2-for-1 here because we summarize her article and our article in brief. So we just added to what Baldwin said. So yeah, we're going to just briefly touch on what a registered report is and then talk about how they hold value, what people think they might do for qualitative research and what actually we think they can do. So firstly, for anyone that doesn't know, registered reports, they're a publishing format whereby you submit your study at kind of like the design stage. So you sort of submit the manuscript up to methods before you've collected and analysed your data. And at that point, you get a peer review and then or assuming that they say, yes, we'd like to accept it, you respond to reviewers' comments. And then if that stage 1 manuscript is accepted, you collect your data, you analyse it, you finish your manuscript, you submit your stage 2 manuscript, and it's got in principle acceptance. So if it's been accepted at stage 1, it should be published at stage 2, assuming you more or less follow your protocol. Basically, whatever your results show, good, bad, indifferent. So the aim of registered reports is to kind of move away from this pressure to publish sexy stuff. A little bit what Stephen spoke about this morning, this kind of metricization in academia, where we're all interested in the journal that we're publishing in, its impact factor, and having these sexy results. Chris Chambers is a big proponent of registered reports, and a quote by him, just that end bit, that often unbiased, negative and complicated findings lose out to cherry-picked highlights that can bring prominent articles, grant funding, promotion and esteem. So there is lots of pressure to produce this exciting research, and often that kind of outweighs conducting research that is of a really high standard, that is very rigorous, and is transparent and reproducible. So registered reports are an effort to kind of reform that process. Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. They're also a really practical push towards open research. I think, as I understand it, that it's a requirement for stage 1 manuscripts to be open access. Yes, Ola's nodding at me. And I think also for the data underlying studies to be open access as well. So they're quite practically pushing for open science practices. And I think one of the big selling points for registered reports is that they really tried to stamp out questionable research practices. And this is a favorite figure, I think, of the Open Science Framework, the kind of things that they are designed to discourage. So low statistical power, p-hacking, harking, I've put that there for all the qualitative researchers in the room, is hypothesizing after the results are known. I had no idea. Publication bias, so lots of things that they can try and minimize. And actually, I just added this, which I thought was quite interesting, that the OSF had a campaign in 2019 to try and encourage people to spread the word about how wonderful registered reports could be. And this was their little like campaign poster that you could download from their website.
Going back to the visualization that you had, again, in thinking about the particular focus we're going to be talking about more, all very statistical language in thinking about some of the practices that this is sort of talking about challenging. So inherent to a lot of the guidance on this has been this focus because of where it was born from. You can see it present there. You know, in qualitative research, we're not talking about p-hacking. That's not a concern. But there are other forms of research practices that are relevant there. But even in a lot of this kind of early guidance and kind of still developing guidance, the language and the kind of visuals that are used still kind of are grounded in that kind of statistical practice phrasing.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning, paper came out last year by Baldwin called Misaligned Incentives in Mental Health Research, the Case for Registered Reports. And Baldwin, in this paper, she makes the case for registered reports as a solution to some of those questionable research practices that are going on in the mental health research space. Things like harking, p-hacking, lack of replicability and things like that. And in the paper, she explores some of the advantages of registered reports and then also some of the challenges, which I will just summarize. So she kind of breaks down the advantages for the researcher and then for the field, which is really just kind of an upscale of researcher benefits often. So she points to the fact that there are lower rejection rates. And actually there are quite a lot of studies recently looking at the impact that registered reports have had. And so she put some quite nice stats in from different studies that have happened. So low rejection rates, which obviously is nicer, and it saves time resubmitting elsewhere. It takes the pressure off because even if your results aren't exciting, you still know they're going to be published. And then I think in line with that, it reduces the pressure to engage in questionable research practices. And then for the field, there is a reduction in questionable research practices. So QRPs, not QPRs, not the football team. So there's a couple of papers. There's a study that's looked at registered reports in psychology and psychiatry studies, and 56% of registered report manuscripts didn't support their first hypothesis versus 4% of those studies that weren't published in the registered report format, but with comparable citation rates. So reduced QRPs, but still studies being used in the field. And then there's another study, so she cited a study that shows that the perception of the quality of the research is higher, and that's based on scientists reviewing a set of papers. Some were RRs and some weren't. So that they're of perceived higher quality and also of improved reproducibility. Because of some of those requirements about open data and code, and this disincentivization to conceal results. So they are good. There are some challenges, and there's 4 key points that Baldwin makes. Firstly, time delays. So you've said in your protocol this is what you're going to do, and then there are always challenges, right, in collecting data, and then you're trying to, or you need to collect data, and the review process for the stage 1 hasn't gone through, and things like that. So there are always challenges. Deviations from protocol, so you can't access the data set, whatever that might be, things like that. And there are solutions to things like that in terms of keeping your editor updated, writing alternative protocols, and so on. And you can also withdraw it as a registered report as well. Knowledge of existing data. So the idea is that you haven't seen the data before. And if you're working with a data set that you're analysing multiple times, and that can be a challenge. And then also statistical power. So Oda and I read this paper and we thought, great, really raising an important issue, but what about for qualitative research?
I was so excited. I was like, someone's talking about them in mental health research. We'd been exploring them, and then I read it and I kept waiting for them to talk about qualitative stuff. And I got to the end and I was like, oh, she's just not doing that. It was a really, really great piece, but for people who were using that in other spaces and actually were coming up with really distinct challenges, we thought it was really interesting that it's a great piece that at no point did Baldwin say, oh, and I'm only focusing on quantitative work. It was, here are the benefits in here are the benefits in mental health research. It wasn't like it was a piece that was explicitly geared around quantitative. And what we found interesting, I'm sure that's also just about the kind of research that Jessie's involved in. But we found it interesting that it might not have kind of crossed minds through the process, through the peer review process, through the editorial process, that hadn't been thought about as maybe actually even just a sentence somewhere to acknowledge that maybe that wasn't in remit. We thought it was really interesting that perhaps the assumption was that it just wasn't really relevant to all areas of mental health research. So we framed our response as a commentary and extension on that paper, because I was basically complaining in a meeting about the fact that there was this exciting paper and we had all this opportunity to talk about qual work. And one of our colleagues said, well, why don't you write that down? So very helpfully, we did get a nudge from somebody to kind of actually say, well, we've been applying that in a different kind of methodological space and actually have quite a lot of reflections on that.
And I think, I guess before we go into our paper, it was the feeling that not just in Baldwin's paper, but the kind of narrative around registered reports, but also around how people hold and think about qualitative research, is that the registered report is just something that isn't available to qualitative researchers.
An editor said that to us, didn't they?
Yeah. So when we were looking for a home for our registered report, we had someone come back to us and say, why would you do that? So we just wanted to, I think, raise awareness of the opportunity that is there, and that actually what you need to do is think about them potentially differently. Yes, I'll move on. So we've written a nice commentary. Please go and read it if you've got a spare 10 minutes. Expanding the vision of registered reports for qualitative mental health research. And we pull out, so we know that lots of what Baldwin said applies, and we just try to put it in a qualitative context. So it still reduces pressure to publish. We as in qualitative research, there is still this pressure to publish novel work. I think the biggest thing that certainly came through for me in the process is getting feedback at stage one was so valuable. And it really, I think, it's less about reproducibility but more about documenting the process, about exactly what you're doing. And I think that's something that's often seen as difficult in qualitative research. So being quite explicit about that. QRPs happen in qualitative research, and it reduces those. And if we know that open research is a driving marker of quality, and we've spoken about it in terms of promotion frameworks this morning, then it elevates the status of the work as well.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd say on that is I know this, and I know from talking to people that lots of people who are more qualitative method inclined can feel really uncomfortable with open research practices. And so when we did a lot of thinking about that during this paper, and we'll talk a little bit more about, like, we're not saying this is a relevant practice in all qualitative contexts. There are lots of situations where this might not work. But particularly that idea of documenting the process. A lot of quality and rigor guidance in qualitative research talks extensively about auditability and actually having really trustworthy processes and documenting that. And actually, when you look at how registered reports work and the idea of having understood the original thinking and how you have followed that through a project, that's actually something that qualitative researchers are encouraged to document, because it is such a messy process and it's part of our trustworthiness guidance that you would be doing that. It's difficult. But to me, this is another opportunity to actually demonstrate the level of care that a lot of qualitative researchers put into that process, or that we use in qualitative methods. I know I stopped us from saying qualitative researchers repeatedly as someone who isn't one. Yeah.
I think just a nod to that in terms of what Ola was saying, the challenges that we identify in the paper is that there is this feeling like I'm going to be so constrained in the way I can go about my data and exploring my data and the analysis, because I've already told the journal what I'm going to do. There's a feeling of kind of, are we stifling that organic research process that qualitative research is? The fact that there's a feeling that you need to put hypotheses in, which actually isn't true. It's just a kind of a standard format for a registered report, but that's because of its origin in quant research. So hypotheses aren't necessary. And one of actually the biggest barriers or challenges, certainly from our perspective, is that there's very little guidance. All that is written about registered reports is based on quant work. And so there is very little guidance to follow. I'm conscious of time, but we will just talk you through, I guess, our experiences. So I led a focus group study that looked at developing dimensions for a mental health measure. And we did this in the registered report format. And we published through Peer Community In, which is a non-profit organisation that manages the peer review of registered reports across a range of different disciplines. And so PCI has a range of registered report friendly journals. So once PCI recommended it, then those journals will accept it. So we went through that process, and we had an open peer review process. So we knew our peer review, or we knew the names of our peer reviewers. And in fact, that's published on the PCI website, so you can see those reviews. And I guess for us, it was about hoping that the reviewers agreed our study design was appropriate for that format. And actually, the feedback we got at stage 1 was mega. It was really, really helpful. And then also the feedback at stage 2, it was a very difficult paper to write. I know they all are difficult to write. We included some qualitative hypotheses in ours. I realized I missed the title on my slide. Never mind. We included some qualitative hypotheses in ours to be kind of like, to show our positionality, I suppose, which was helpful. It was helpful in our thinking. We had some challenges around timelines because we're working in schools, and we actually collected some of our data pre-finalizing the stage 1 report, and that's kind of transparent on the PCI process. So there was some flexibility in the process for us, but overall, the feedback we got was immensely helpful to improve the study and improve our ways of describing and thinking about how we were handling the data, how we share the data. So all our coding is on OSF, our coding framework, things like that. So overall, it was very valuable to the study.
So I've been involved in a few registered reports. This was the first qualitative one that I'd led. We had, in this case, we had a journal that was a really great fit. We would have gone to them even if we weren't doing a registered report, but they did have a registered report option, that they were open to qualitative work. I think they even said that explicitly on their website. I can't remember if this was one of the times that we had to email somebody. I think it was clear on their website. That was particularly about the qualitative strand of a trial evaluation of a social and emotional learning intervention in schools. So we're talking to teachers, children, young people, senior leaders in schools about their experiences. We're doing registered reports throughout that project as a whole, but in particular for the qualitative strand, I was hoping that we could get feedback on the design early on before we were going out and having those conversations, thinking about the data collection approaches. We had a conceptual framework in place for how we were structuring those conversations and how we were analysing those conversations. Getting input on that early on seemed really sensible. And Jo has written that we offered qualitative hypotheses, which, well, it's my fault for not double checking. What we actually had in this paper, we didn't set qualitative hypotheses, but we did set out our conceptual framework in detail so that it was really clear how we were going to be approaching that data and how we were going to be coding that. The reviewer kind of feedback that we got was around broadening contributions beyond this intervention. They felt that kind of the way we were framing that in the initial part of the paper wasn't taking advantage of that. On the face of it, that sounds like something that could be dealt with through a normal peer review of a full paper, but actually it helped us push some of the ways we were having conversations in the analysis stage. So it has actually been really useful in the kind of earlier stages of this as well, whereas we might have needed to go back and think about that differently had it come up later, or it might have just been a tweak in the framing in the paper instead of something that actually came into our thinking a little bit more. Again, a challenge, they did also suggest that we comment a bit more on, well, they said, could you think differently about how you think about school types for the case studies in recruitment? We had already recruited our schools by the time reviews came back in. So it was, again, it's one of the kind of timing challenges that we were just trying to wait to at least go to the schools. But we already had our schools in place. So it's just become a limitation that it meant that we didn't have a specific type of school, that actually it was a really good point from them. We could just already pin them down. So again, it's these challenges in practices. It's not straightforward when you're working on kind of timelines, which for us also included times of year that schools are really busy and realistically needing to have conversations at certain points. Also got us further kind of talking about team positionality in the piece. And yeah, one of the things that was quite difficult for us was that particular strand of work is covering a lot of different aspects of implementation. And I'm curious about whether if we weren't doing a registered report format, that actually would have just been 3 papers at the end, and instead it's one very broad brush paper. But we're still exploring. We've got 2 or 3 ideas that have come out of the analysis of this. There isn't enough time spent on this thing, and actually we need follow-up work. There's some mixed method opportunities. So I don't think it's been a problem, but I think it was a challenging thing to kind of talk about early on of actually that might be much more relevant in other research projects, to say actually it might have made sense to focus down on specific aspects, as is often the case in some qualitative work. Yeah, one lesson from that is not on the slides because it's only been recent is we're working on stage 2 of that at the moment. Really obvious thing to probably all of you is just to keep an eye on the word count of the registered stage 1 report, because it did not occur to me that I didn't have enough room to do the findings justice. Luckily, the editor has given me another 1,000 words, but it was a good shout on the fact that the edits we'd made in response to reviewers in stage 1, I hadn't kept an eye on what the implications for the overall word count were. And you can't then rewrite your introduction later on to be shorter. So that was a lesson that I'm hoping would be obvious to anybody in this room, but was not obvious to me. So please take my learning.
Okay, the too long didn't listen. Registered reports are compatible with qualitative research in our minds. We just need a slightly broader understanding of what we're looking for in terms of transparency. It's not about redoing that code. It's about here's what we did and exactly what we did, and here's the steps we took. Not everything should be an RR, definitely not. You know, if you're going to do really exploratory analysis, it's not for you. But I think also there's something written about them in where you can have some exploratory work in an RR, for example, as long as it doesn't overwhelm the discussion. It's not the kind of centerpiece of the paper. It's okay. There can be some deviation from best laid plans. There always are. It's just about being kind of transparent about it. Oh yeah, there we go. For an exploratory analysis is not letting it dominate. We definitely need some more guidance, I think. But they do have the potential to add value in terms of thinking about qualitative research, qualitative research. And I might just let Ola finish on a final thought on this kind of liberal approach.
What was my final thought?
That you might change your mind.
Oh, that might change my mind. I thought there was a really nice comment this morning. I think it was from Stephen about being humble enough to know we might make mistakes. There are people in qualitative research who are so fundamentally opposed to open science principles being brought into those worlds. I've had great and interesting conversations about that. And they definitely shaped when we were writing that paper. I was really, really keen that we not say, oh, you know, we don't want someone to come away from this piece saying, oh, all qual researchers should be doing registered reports and open research practices, and if they're not, then it's bad. You know, that I don't think is true or appropriate. And I think that there's lots of circumstances in which there's discomfort with how these track into qualitative spaces. I think there are some instances where it's useful. I changed my mind on various things as we were writing that piece. And I think I made us write in there somewhere. We might feel differently in a year. Here's our current thinking about this. This is still something taking shape. I don't think I do feel differently right now. I think I might do in a bit. But I think that thing of this is very exploratory in terms of thinking about how these methods track into qualitative work, because they haven't all been applied in that space, and the kind of assumptions they're grounded in can be much more informed by post-positivist epistemologies. I think that it's really important that we think really critically about that. And so I'm trying to be very conscious of that as we move through working through it as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That's really, really interesting. Do we have any questions in the room? Ola and Joe? Couple of questions.
Really lovely presentation and really nice work. I mean, it's great to see such innovation coming from the ground level. I mean, the introduction of registered reports, primarily, I guess, through the field of psychology and cross-chamber work and whatnot, was in response to, very sort of high-profile cases of hacking and hawking and misbehavior and underpowered studies. I mean, the main benefit here obviously seems to be increased rigor and the input and feedback you get at the stage one, and that's obviously a benefit to the research and probably broadens the research question. So I guess the next stage for you perhaps is how many journals can you convince to adopt this practice, and within the field of qualitative research, which is completely outside my purview, what's the sense that actually this is something that we need to do or we should be doing? You make a very persuasive case, but obviously not every person you speak to is sympathetic.
I would say there is not a sense that we should be doing this
At all? We've just said that we should.
I know, but Stephen, as our sort of in the field,
I think the option is useful.
But I think there are other kind of ideas of open research that qualitative researchers might lean more towards than this. And I think the primary issue is the perception of what a registered report is, and not really understanding the value it can hold. Yes.
I think the point of I found it interesting that because the piece we wrote was in response to an article that was very focused on questionable research practices. We had a lot of discussion about the fact that we needed to frame our extension to that piece a little bit through that same lens, but actually we had a lot of conversation around this as we were building it. And a lot of the conversation we had was actually the values for qualitative research are less about that questionable research practice, but we also see that those registered reports are bringing other benefits, and certainly I think qualitative research can benefit from those. I think it would be useful if more journals understood that it was an option, but that it not become a mandated option or one where research becomes seen as questionable if it's not gone through that process, particularly I don't know that there's journals that would view it that way per se anyway, but that if there's more of a move towards open science becoming more embedded, that not becomes something that qualitative researchers become hamstrung by, I think would be my concern. So I think some of the issue we had was that there were journals that said, I think particularly in that social media one, there were journals that said they did registered reports and generally publish different kinds of methods, and then you write to them about a qual registered report and they just go, I don't even know why you would do that. So even just having that awareness of how that might work and making it an option, but I think definitely not something that becomes mandated, to use your framing.
I'm conscious of time, so I think just one more question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, thanks very much. Lovely talk, and these are interesting issues I think about myself a bit as well as also a mixed methods researcher. So I appreciate you're not saying that we necessarily should apply this across the board, but just linking to the last question, I guess registered reports are like an intervention to address questionable research practices in quant research. Should we be thinking in a similarly sort of like revolutionizing what the manuscript might look like for the questionable research practices that we see in qualitative research as an alternative to the registered report? So some of the things you've mentioned already are around like word counts, and maybe also about how we might have positionality and reflexivity embedded into the articles more clearly. So that's not really a question, but is that something that we should be thinking about as well and looking at?
Yeah,
I definitely have thoughts on it. So I think definitely it's been interesting exploring the work that is the limited work that is done around qualitative register reports, of thinking about it encouraging that kind of opening up of thinking. And I think that is something that can shape our wider thinking about manuscript writing. So as someone who does both qual and quant research, I often want to write in both formats about positionality and reflexivity. And when we're stuck on word count, it's the first thing that goes from, certainly when I say to other co-authors, right, one of the things I want you to be mindful of is word count. They'll just be like, do we need this whole section? Not, I made that sound like it's a full page. It's often not, but it's something that's seen as so inherent to qualitative processes, and I would argue should be seen as really inherent to quantitative processes, but is often not raised in the same way. It's often a really key part of, there's so much positionality work done hopefully in qualitative research, so much kind of cyclical work happening, so much happening to make that trustworthiness work and make that credibility of the process work. And we often end up not writing about it. And I do agree that I think that this kind of practice actually is a really good lesson in opening up those processes is good, and talking about what you expected at the outset. Often when we're asked to put a comment on who the team is, it's just saying, we have these interests, instead of saying, well, actually, when we went into this, we expected these kinds of things to come up, or, the kind of historical experience or the existing experience we have might have made us expect that these kinds of things would be seen as really important, and actually here's how that was challenged. We don't often write explicitly about the extensive processes that we go through in qual, and I do agree. I think that this kind of process has shown me actually there is value in us holding firm and saying, no, it's worthwhile to include a documentation of that. And I do think a lot of quality guidance for qual work kind of is vague and broad about what you might document in that sense. So I think some more guidance and exploring of what that might look like in a way that remains brief is useful.
Yeah, much agreed. Thanks very much for that. Thank you.